Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
First one is titled, I Quit. When I was in high school, I worked at a fast food chain. I literally made enough to pay my car insurance and drive myself to school with about $50 to $60 left over to spend. I was a part-time worker and after working there a few months got offered a weekend gig. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Friday and Saturday. It sucked, but it was a bit more money due to hours and a promised raise. I got about 5 cents. The first weekend I worked, the business made the most it ever had on that schedule. I was polite and I had return customers. I was basically the weekend manager, without being a manager. I was told this. Well, one of our managers was a horrible lady. Lazy, snide, etc. She had a bad habit of coming in at 8 to 9 a.m. to relieve me from my shifts. I was kind of a manager, right? So I couldn't just leave. I was told this. So one evening, while my parents were out of town, my car wouldn't start. I knew I had friends that could take me, but it would take a while to get them there. So I called up work to let them know I was on my way, but I might be a few minutes late. So Lady Manger decides to yell, threaten my job. How dare I told her I was doing my best and I would get there. I called some friends, got a ride, with no solid ride home, and walked in about 5 to 10 minutes late. I mean, I was proud of being able to get there so fast, but she just exploded. She was just so inconvenienced at those 5 to 10 minutes. Even while I was thinking about how messed up it all was and being quite upset, I apologized. I was a very timid teenager, for being late, and tried to explain that I had called. She did know, and I had indeed made it like I said I would. She would not stop. She had nothing else on me but this one time. That was all. And she kept yelling. The other night worker, only 2 people on nights, was just watching with a holy crap look. So finally I broke. I called her out on all those times she had been over an hour late and how I never complained. How these 5 to 10 minutes was nothing compared to going to school, then working a 10-hour shift. Then I told her to get bent, figure out the schedule herself, because I wasn't going to be treated that way, so I quit. I stepped out and called my friends to pick me up. A few minutes later the other guy walked out. We chatted a few minutes. It was his first day, I was supposed to train him. After the blow up he said he didn't want to work there anymore. He actually thanked me. She kind of screwed herself. I never asked how it went, but I doubt she managed on her own. Next one is titled, How My Grandpa Became the Owner of a Gas Station, Garage. My family immigrated America in the 1880s and settled in Nebraska. We were farmers for the first 80 years or so, but back in the 1960s my great-grandma decided she was going to sell the entire farm before she died and simply give her sons 1/3 of money for inheritance when she passed. She had 3 sons. In 1969 my great-grandma passed, and her 3 sons inherited the money she had earned from selling the farm. My grandpa decided he would basically let that money sit until after he retired from the military. In 1971 he deployed to Vietnam for his second and final deployment. At the end of his deployment he returned to Nebraska and retired after 22 years in the service. Now he had an old Chevy truck at the time and was in the process of building a concrete business with the money he had gotten from his inheritance. Well, during this time, his truck engine blew up. My grandpa was busy at the time and he didn't want to fool with the truck because he was busy. So he bought himself the engine he wanted to replace it with, which was an upgrade, and he went down to the only garage in town and asked them if they'd be willing to put the engine in the truck. They agreed on a price, and told him to come back in a week or so. A week later my grandpa comes back and picks up the truck. He admits he felt like a fool for not double-checking the work, but assumed since this was the son of his friend that the son would do right by him. This was a small town. Well, my grandpa opens up the concrete business, and he's busy, and it comes time for his first oil change. This is about 4 months after he got the truck back. He's doing the oil change and he notices that the engine he bought isn't the engine in his truck. It's a smaller engine. This obviously pisses him off to high heaven, as my grandma liked to say. So he storms on down to the garage and talks to shop. Earl was the owner. Earl comes out, and denies any wrongdoing. Says he did as he was told, and it shouldn't have taken him 4 months to bring the issue up. My grandpa tells Earl he needs to do what's right. Earl refuses. It's important to note, this is a small town. Written contracts and so forth really isn't a thing. Your worth is your word. My grandpa tells Earl he's going to get him for this. Earl laughs and tells him to leave his shop. My grandpa goes down to the county and requests the record for who owns that gas station. Turns out it's an old family friend named Harold. My grandpa stops by Harold's house and starts inquiring about the business deal Harold has with Earl. Harold says Earl rents the gas station garage from him. My grandpa asks Harold how is everything going, and Harold confides that Earl hasn't paid his rent in 2 months. My grandpa asks, "Do you have a written lease with Earl?" To which Harold goes, "Nah, I sure don't." My grandpa then asks, "What if I bought the gas station garage from you?" Harold isn't completely on board with the idea, but my grandpa makes a strong point. Earl isn't paying his rent. Harold doesn't seem like he has much interest in being a landlord anymore, and my grandpa has the cash to buy the place outright. Harold, sensing something is up, asks my grandpa, "Did Earl do something to you? You seem awfully interested in this garage. Ain't you busy with that concrete business of yours?" And my grandpa fills Harold in on the story. My grandpa also mentions that he has a son, my father, who needs something to do, and he'd be happy to buy the whole building from Harold for a fair price, and what happens after that is his business. Also, it's important to note, when Harold decided to rent this business to Earl, in that deal went all the equipment and tools that Harold had acquired over the years, so those belonged to the building. Harold and my grandpa came to a number that they both agreed on. A few days later, my grandpa paid Harold in cash, in full, for the business. The paperwork is done, and my grandpa is now the proud owner of a gas station and mechanic shop. Now my grandpa senses that Earl ain't going to be too pleased when my grandpa fires Earl, so for extra good measure my grandpa calls up the local sheriff, who is a high school friend, and asks the sheriff to come with him to break the news to Earl. So my grandpa and the sheriff go down to Earl's now former business, and they walk in, and before my grandpa can even say hello, Earl says, "Now I told you, I didn't cheat you." My grandpa smiles and says, "I'm not here about my truck, I'm here to fire you." Earl, with a look of confusion on his face, asks, "You can't fire me. I own this business." My grandpa shows him the title and says, "I'm now the owner of this building," to which Earl fires back, "But I got a deal with Harold." And the sheriff speaks up, "You do? Do you have a lease?" "Well, no," Earl says, to which the sheriff smiles and says, "In that case, you're going to need to take your stuff and leave." Earl is fuming, upset, grabs his toolbox and storms out. My grandpa ended up hiring the mechanic that would occasionally work on his trucks at his concrete business. He had my aunt and grandma run the gas station full-time, and my dad would work there after school. We owned that garage for 25 years before my grandpa sold it to someone else. Next one is titled, "Get Mouthy, and See What Happens." This happened many years ago. My youngest daughter's sperm donor, SD, and I had recently moved to Michigan, Traverse City area, and decided to take a day trip to Sault Ste. Marie to explore. This would require taking the Mackinac Bridge. This is important. Anyhow, as we were getting ready for our trip, SD was acting the a-hole and really getting on my nerves, but no amount of telling him to knock it off did any good. Why, I don't know, he decided I was going to drive. His first big mistake. We reached the bridge and traffic was heavy and slow, but moving steadily. We got to about the center of the first third, and I noticed just how high up we were. I mean, I saw a cargo barge passing the bridge, and it looked like a toy. A really small toy. Like, Matchbox car-sized toy. And both me and the SD have a thing about heights. Well, for me, it's mostly a fear of falling, and so far, I was fine. I was mostly watching the traffic ahead of me, so not much opportunity to look down. The SD, on the other hand, was a bit pale. Of course, it didn't stop him from being a dick. We reached the suspension part of the bridge, and suddenly, the inside lane went from asphalt to something that looked like wire mesh, that you could see through. I was in the outside lane, so I was good. SD, however, his eyes were as big as saucers. But he still ran his mouth. He never was very smart. Traffic slowed in the outside lane, but was moving on the inside, wire mesh lane. SD made his second big mistake. He sarcastically commented maybe we should change lanes. I knew it was sarcasm. I knew he didn't really want me to. I did it anyway. I gotta tell you, it made my pooter pucker, but it was so worth it to watch his obnoxious ass totally freak out. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. Get back to the other lane. Can't, I pointed. There was no way to get back in the other lane at this point. Traffic in that lane was bumper to bumper. Friends, that boy got so pale he made ice white look gray. It was a thing of beauty, I gotta tell you. And he was quiet the rest of the way across the bridge. We even had a lovely outing with him behaving himself. On the way home, he pleaded with me not to take that lane, no matter how much traffic was in the outside one. I told him, if he even so much as made one a holish peep, I was going to the inside lane and would stay there. In the end, I even cured myself of my own phobia, so win-win. Next one is titled, It Took Me 42 Years, but I Finally Got You Back for Throwing Me in the Creek. This happened many years ago, but the revenge came in February 2020. Growing up we never had swim lessons, and while I could manage to swim across a pool, I was not a strong swimmer and was especially scared of being in moving water that was over my head, rivers, large creeks, etc. For the first approximately 10 years of my life, my dad lived on a large farm that had a big but beautiful mountain creek along the edge of one field. My parents divorced when I was 2-ish, but they got along well, and my brother, full sib, and I would spend the summers with our dad and his other 2 kids. He remarried his first wife after he and my mom separated, and they had 2 older children. Wayne was my half-brother and 7 years older than me. So one summer when I was 7 he was 14 and so much larger than me. It was common knowledge that I was scared of swimming in the deep parts of the creek, but Wayne insisted everybody instinctively knows how to swim. There was a massive rock the size of a small house that we used to fish from, and my other siblings would jump in the creek from there, only approximately 10 feet above the water, but it was a very deep hole. When you jumped in you had to swim a ways downstream in order to find a place to climb out and back up on the rock. It was a hot day, as summers tended to be in Arkansas, and we were done fishing. Then Wayne said everyone should jump in, knowing that I had zero intention of doing that. So he started teasing me and eventually picked me up. I was scared, but thought surely he wasn't actually going to throw me in. Well, I was wrong. He walked over to the edge and tossed me off the rock. I was as terrified as I'd ever been before or since. I did manage to make it back to shore, but was screaming so loud our stepmom heard me from the house approximately 100 yards away, and she came running out. I don't even remember if he got in any trouble, but he felt justified because I did in fact get myself back to shore without dying. But I developed a deeper phobia of swimming from then until I went away to college and decided to take swimming lessons. Now I'm a biologist, have traveled all over the US working in streams and lakes including Alaska and Hawaii. I have logged over 9,000 hours underwater, scuba, which is an insane amount of time and could only be done because I worked full-time literally underwater, though not very deep, so I could log a lot of hours in a day, for 20 years. I think I only saw Wayne 2 to 3 more times in my life after I left for college. He passed away last year after a 2+ year battle with cancer. We were not close at all, I didn't even like him, but it was sad and my other siblings mourned for him. His daughter, grandson and mother are all still alive, and so out of respect for them I went back for the funeral and had nothing bad to say about him. I was just there to be supportive and see a lot of family I hadn't seen in years. He was cremated and we buried most of his ashes in a small cemetery in the Ozark Mountains near our childhood homes. But before the funeral I took a small amount of ashes. The day after the funeral I asked my other brother if he'd like to go visit our dad's old place on the creek. We made an afternoon of it with his 3 sons. The driveway was a mile long and gated, so we hiked in, brought food to sit on the rock above the creek and have lunch and tell my nephews stories about growing up there. After lunch and while nobody was watching, I took out Wayne's ashes and threw his ass off that same rock 42 years after he had done the same to me. I made it to shore and climbed out back then, but part of Wayne will forever be in that creek now. And it was very cathartic, if not mean. I didn't tell anyone in the family what I was doing and don't plan to because I didn't want to cause any damage or future problems. What happened wasn't just between Wayne and me, and now all of you. Sorry that was so long. Next one is titled, Insane Manager Gets Crazier When I Quit. I worked at a fast food chain when I was in high school for 2.5 years. It was a place both my older siblings had worked at, and I knew it as a business that was good for students. When my manager hired me, it was with the understanding that I would work one evening during the week, and be the first person off of the shift, and Saturday mornings, with the occasional weekend night. He agreed on this because I was in advanced classes and made it clear I wouldn't be able to work more during the week. He was fine with this, and work went great for years. When I say this place was slammed all the time, I mean it. This place offered food that had never before been offered by a fast food place in my area, and I saw the same regulars every week. We also had tons of employees, because they catered to students, who couldn't work a lot of shifts. I really enjoyed this place and took pride in learning every position and training new employees. The main manager was eventually let go because of a drinking problem. They brought in someone else with a completely different mindset. He started to let go everyone who couldn't work a lot and brought in people who seemed desperate for work. The atmosphere completely changed. When before the people I worked with were eager and friendly high schoolers and college students, I was suddenly working with people who seemed to have really rough lives. They were always late, always scrambling, unfriendly to customers, and had horrible attitudes. They also used drugs on the property, spent a lot of time out smoking by the trash cans, and often left, leaving me with the keys, and as acting as manager, which made me very uncomfortable. Many shifts we had 6 workers, but only me in the front and someone in the back actually working. My manager started putting pressure on all the high school students who were still working to drop out. He kept telling us how much we'd make full-time. I thought he was insane, but 2 coworkers dropped out senior year because of his promise to make the big bucks. But, almost instantly, he would not give them full-time hours, and they were really upset. They wanted to work all the time, but he'd restrict them. Then, he started giving me shifts during school. I told him I couldn't work them, and he said it was my responsibility to find replacements or not go to school. My other coworkers were eager for shifts, so I always got them covered, but he would get very agitated when I wasn't working the hours he gave me. Eventually, he stopped giving me hours altogether. When I asked him about it, he smirked and said I would get hours when I could work school-time shifts. So, I'd come in each week, check the schedule, and leave. I ended up getting a job as a nanny, so I came in with my clean, pressed uniforms, hat, etc. I came to him and said that I was going to start working. Before I could explain, he flew off the handle and was screaming that he told the other managers not to give me hours until I agreed to work during school. I finally managed to cut him off and said I wasn't working there, that I got another job. I set my uniforms on the counter, and he turned completely red. He threw my uniforms and hat, broke a broom over his knee, kicked the doors to the back, and just kept screaming. He was saying I was one of the only employees that knew all the positions and that he expected me to train all the new hires. He kept saying he didn't know what he was going to do now, and that I was screwing him over. Every time I stopped by to check my schedule, the poorly trained newer employers were having a really hard time, getting orders wrong, etc. I eventually just left. All my regulars stopped coming. There were never lines. And the business closed. It was sad to see a place that had been so successful fail, but a petty part of me was glad that at least the manager wouldn't be torturing any more high school kids. P.S. I was 17 when I quit, female, and in the US, if any of that matters. Last one is titled, Aunt Judy's Tasty Tale of Petty Revenge. As title suggests, this is a tale of my aunt, as told by my father, and my aunt's ex-husband Mick. Back in the mid to late 70s, my Aunt Judy was married to Mick. One night Judy and Mick had a massive argument, the details of which have been lost to time. However, Judy believed in not going to bed angry. And so the next morning Mick thought all was fine, and forgiven. Judy had even made his lunch for him like she normally did. That was until he got to work and opened up his lunchbox. Judy had indeed made his lunch, a ham and cheese sandwich wrapped in a garbage bag, and a slice of cake, again wrapped in a garbage bag, a clean garbage bag, but a garbage bag, all the same. Mick had the great debate if he should eat his lunch or go hungry. Hunger won out, so he unwrapped his lunch, inspected it, and took an attentive bite. Mick's friends thought it was hilarious, and gave him crap about it for years afterwards. Judy later confessed she hadn't done anything to the meal itself, just wrapped it in a garbage bag. I met Mick when I was 12 years old in 1999. He and Aunt Judy had been divorced for a good 20+ years at that stage, and he still told the tale. Aunt Judy passed away just over 3 years ago, and whilst I wasn't close to her, every time my husband does something irritating, which isn't all that often, I think back to Judy and Mick. Thanks for listening.